afternoon, good evening to all of you, our friends. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces, but also some new faces. It's a pleasure having you with us. This is our fourth webinar that we are doing as preparational webinars for our upcoming conference this November in both Bethlehem and Jerusalem, here in a very troubled piece of land. The past few months have been filled with religious holidays. We went from Easter, since the beginning of the year, we've been through the Eastern Christmas, the Orthodox and the Armenian Christmases. We've been through Ramadan, we've been through Lent, we've been through the Western Easter. We are in Passover, and next week we head towards the Holy Week for the Orthodox churches, and so much holiness, so much prayers, yet so much blood and so much violence. Religion calls people to be kind with one another, to try to connect with the Creator, to walk together, to journey together as humanity. Yet religion also causes conflicts. This is the theme of the conference, religious extremism, but we're also addressing the realities where there is an apartheid system, where there is discrimination, where there is plenty of violence. I hope that we appreciate everybody joining us online, and to continue to join us or to see the recordings that we are hosting. But also we hope to see you in person. It's nice to be together online, but call us old-fashioned. We'd love to be together. We're happy that our brothers and sisters at Christ at the Checkpoint are holding their conference in May. Already 130 people who have registered and are planning to come. We hope to have a bigger number in November. I hope that the war by then or by tomorrow will be over, and I hope that there will be peace. But peace to be accomplished needs peacemakers, and that's the purpose of our meetings, to identify where the problems are, to challenge them, and to work together to make this world a better place. So I leave you in the hands of our good friend, Reverend Stephen Sizer.
It's a delight to see you with us today. This special webinar, Christophobia and Persecution of Christians. As Omar has said, it's the fourth in our series of pre-conference webinars. We've addressed the theme of the conference, religious extremism, and then the first and the second subsequent webinars have addressed anti-Semitism and Zionism, and then Islamophobia and Islam. So today we are looking at the persecution of Christians and Christophobia. And we have three distinguished speakers contributing to our webinar. We have Rabbi Brant Rosen, the Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton, and the Reverend Dr. Paul Mc Allister. There will be an opportunity after each has presented for about 15 minutes for them to engage with each other, ask questions of clarification and stimulate some discussion. And then we'll be monitoring your questions, which we invite you to place in the chat. If you'd like to ask a question of one of our speakers, then add it to the chat. And then when we come to the end of that part of the webinar, after the three speakers have contributed to each other, dialogue with each other, we will turn to your questions, and then we will wrap up. And the aim is to finish in 1 hour and a half. So 1 hour, 25 minutes time, we will bring the webinar to a close. So it's a delight to introduce our first speaker today, the Rabbi Brant Rosen. Brant is the founding rabbi of the Jewish congregation Tzedek Chicago and the co-founder of Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. Welcome, Brant. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to Sabeel. Thank you all for being here. I'm honored to be part of this presentation and conversation. And in particular, very honored to be sharing the virtual stage with Reverend Dr. Mc Allister and Reverend Dr. Middleton, and looking forward to the conversation. I want to just begin by lifting up the fact, as was already mentioned, that we are holding this program in a time of genocide. And I think it's important that whatever we say in this program today, we make sure that it is not disconnected from this overall context in which we find ourselves. This tragic, terrifying genocidal war of vengeance that has been unleashed over the last several months, but really did not begin 7 months ago, is part of a larger context. And I think much of what we'll be talking about today will be connected to this. And it's my hope that this conversation and this program is not strictly academic, that it does not occur in a vacuum, but that it contributes to our commitment to, first and foremost, ending the most immediate bloodshed that is going on, but also to redouble our efforts to a truly just solution for all who live in the land, dismantling the structures of oppression that have been too long allowed to flourish in the land, and to transform it into something that is truly equitable for all. As was mentioned, we in the Jewish community are in the midst of the Passover season. We just started the festival of Passover, and this holiday is all about liberation. And liberation, this story that we lift up and interrogate during Passover, the Exodus story, is a central story for the Jewish people, if not the most central story. But I'm also very conscious that it is not shared by Jews alone, that the Exodus story has been the inspiration for liberation movements, a myriad of liberation movements throughout history. And my understanding of Passover is that it not only be restricted to commemorating Jewish enslavement and liberation, but in fact using it as a tool for empathy in a universal sense, finding common cause with all who struggle against Pharaoh and seek liberation in every generation. So with that, I'd like to begin by addressing the issue of anti-Christian and Christophobia, anti-Christian reality in Israel-Palestine and Christophobia in general. I want to begin by noting, and I think this is probably not lost on the organizers of this program, that last year in particular, observers noted and Christian leaders in Palestine noted that there was a major spike in anti-Christian violence. This was throughout the news coming from Israel-Palestine. And I think it's important to underline that this anti-Christian violence did not occur in a vacuum. These were not isolated incidents. In particular, many church leaders in Israel-Palestine noted that the Netanyahu government, the current most far-right government in Israel's history, is actively creating a hostile environment for Christians. And in particular, enabling and allowing settler violence against Christian holy sites, and acts of violence against Christians. It's becoming increasingly clear that not only is the Netanyahu government not doing anything to hold them back, but in many cases, it seems very, very clear that they are inciting this violence. So I just want to give you a little bit of some examples of the kinds of things we're talking about. And I pulled these from news reports from last year, really over the course of last year. 30 graves at a Protestant cemetery on Mount Zion in Jerusalem were vandalized. in Jerusalem alone, there were a myriad of incidents, including a mob of at least a dozen Orthodox Jews overturning tables and throwing chairs at an Armenian Christian restaurant, a Jewish American toppling a statue of Jesus at a church in Jerusalem, 2 Jewish men attacking a bishop and 2 priests during a mass at the Church of Gethsemane, 2 Jewish passersby pepper spraying a young man outside the Armenian convent. And the list goes on and on, both vandalism and acts of personal violence. Sometimes this is by secular Jews, sometimes this is by religious Jews, but it all seems to be enabled in a very clear way by the current government. And in particular, when we see this violence being perpetrated by settlers, which it often is, this is not a coincidence, because the government includes high-ranking officials who are settlers themselves. The finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, is a settler. Israel's national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a settler. And so I think when we look at the spike over this last year, we can clearly make this and should make this connection. However, at the same time, I think it's very, very important to note that anti-Christian attitudes and policies did not begin with the current government. And I would make the argument that it is endemic systemically to Israel through Zionism, through an ideology of Jewish supremacy. The very notion of the importance of creating an ethnic national Jewish nation state that is dependent on the maintenance of a demographic Jewish majority, ipso facto leads to xenophobic attitudes towards all those who are not Jewish, Christians and Muslims, and any non-Jews. Now, in its Declaration of Independence, when Israel declared itself as an independent state in 1948, they stated very explicitly that they would guarantee freedom of religion to all faiths. And this is technically true. But Israel has, and this is very important to underline, Israel is not a completely secular state. Israel has given the rabbinate in particular, the chief rabbis of Israel and the local rabbinic authorities, a great deal of authority over legal matters and civic matters in the state of Israel. And this has caused interreligious tensions for the duration of Israel's existence. So what we are seeing may be a spike, but it is part of a longer continuum. And this is really the essential problem, as I see it. And it's not a problem of Jewish anti-Christian attitudes, or even a problem of any Israeli government or Zionism itself. On a deeper level, I would argue that the essential problem is when we wed religion to state, when religion is wedded to state, and particularly to empire. When that happens, historically, religious minorities within that state will always be vulnerable. And no matter how much the state claims that it is committed to freedom of religion, those who are not part of that dominant faith will remain vulnerable minorities. And during times of greater tension, during times of greater xenophobia, that tension will erupt into the kind of violence that we're seeing now, and I fear will only increase. Now, this is certainly, I should own this, that as an American, as a Jewish American, I feel this tension in my home country. There is a long tension that goes back to the founding of the United States as to whether or not this country is a Christian nation, and that is a tension that we see very much alive to this day. I think with the rise of Christian nationalism in this country, We are seeing in many ways the very same kinds of issues of religious supremacy, of vulnerability of religious minorities within that, and a larger debate over what is the nature of the community we're trying to create. Is it truly a society that makes way for all faiths and traditions and is not subject to the dominance of any one over another? Or will it be subjected to the supremacy of one over the other? I guess I'm feeling that question particularly keenly this Passover because, it is the Exodus story is about the arising of a xenophobic Pharaoh, right? The Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and that was the beginning of the Israelites' deep vulnerability in Egypt, whereas previously they had lived peacefully, but that can always be overturned whenever a state is founded in the name of one particular group of people. So I would go back to this whenever we're talking about the situation in Israel-Palestine, that we can't view anti-Christian attitudes and violence and systemic policies as the problem of any one individual government. We must look at it as something deeper with deeper roots. And in the case of Israel, that issue, I would say, is Zionism itself, a ideology and a movement that seeks to create and maintain an ethnic Jewish majority nation state in historic Palestine. And as long as the system is defined thus, Christians and Muslims and all those who aren't part of the dominant group will be at risk one way or another. I want to make one final point, and that is when we're talking about xenophobia in Jewish tradition or in any religious tradition, I think it's very, very important not to essentialize that xenophobia and project it over an entire tradition or group of people. In other words, I think every religion has its good, its bad, and its ugly. And there are certainly anti-Christian attitudes in Jewish tradition, historically speaking, when we look at classical Jewish texts like the Talmud or even in very important Jewish religious thinkers like Moses Maimonides and others, you will see what I would call repugnant attitudes toward Gentiles and toward Christians. I think it's important, however, when we come across this kind of xenophobic attitude in Jewish tradition, that we not cherry pick these citations and treat them out of context. And in particular, when it comes to Jewish anti-Christian attitudes, it's important to contextualize and bear in mind that much of these attitudes emerged during a time in which Jewish communities, particularly in Europe in the Middle Ages, were oppressed minorities under European Christianity. And these kinds of attitudes did not emerge in a vacuum. It's problematic to cherry pick them both to generalize about Jews and Judaism, but it's also very, very problematic when Jews cherry pick these and use them as incitement to violence against Christians. So in other words, I'm arguing for contextualization. Every religion has its problematic aspects to it. Christianity has no lack of anti-Semitic attitudes historically as well. And I think all people of faith, and I believe this very strongly, all people of faith need to own the all of their traditions. We can't just reject the bad stuff and lift up the good stuff and say about the bad stuff, well, that's not us. As a Jew, I'm not going to look at the xenophobic stuff and say, well, that's not real Judaism. Judaism is the all of Judaism, just the way I would expect my Christian friends and comrades, when they're confronted with xenophobic or anti-Semitic attitudes in their tradition, to say, well, that's not really Christianity. It is Christianity. It's not the all of Christianity, But we need, if we're going to be able to confront it properly, we first need to own it. We need to say, this is part of our heritage. This is part of our received tradition. These are the parts that we will fight against as people of faith in our own communities. These are the parts we will disavow and say there's no place for that. But to completely disown it means to, I think, on some level, to cling to a kind of a myth of innocence, which I don't think is particularly helpful when we're trying to create a world of justice and tolerance and empathy for all. I think the first step is to be able to really be able to admit that when we're part of these large religious faith traditions, within the family, there is all kinds of, as I said before, all kinds of stuff that we inherit, and we need to grapple with it very, very seriously. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over back over to our panel. But again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share with you today, and I'm very, very, very much looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Brant, thank you so much for that presentation. It was very illuminating and very helpful indeed. As you were closing, I was thinking of the illustration Jesus used about taking the plank out of your own eye before offering to take the speck out of your brother's eye. I think that resonates with our responsibility to address our own tradition before we throw stones at others. So thank you very much indeed, Brant. Appreciated that very much. And we look forward to the conversation we can have later with Waltrina and Paul. Our second distinguished speaker today is the Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton. Waltrina is Executive Director of CRS, that's Community Renewal Society in Chicago. CRS is a Black women-led organization. It's over 100 years old, with a mission to eradicate racism and poverty towards becoming or being a beloved community. And it deals with and addresses police brutality, radicalized violence disproportionately affecting Blacks, Browns, Indigenous, and LGBTQ communities. Waltrina is also a poet, womanist scholar, cultural critic, and global activist who's been engaged with human rights activism domestically in the United States and internationally. Waltrina, the floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I bring you greetings from the Community Renewal Society, and thank you to the organizers, fellow panelists, and all who are gathered here. We are called to be the change. What is the change we organize for? Because this in itself can be controversial. As Christians, we are activating our Christological ideals for human good to perpetuate good in oppose and in opposition to white supremacist, patriarchal, and racist propaganda that creates hierarchy and perpetuates dispossession, xenophobia, racism, and ideologies that call for separatism, genocide, and apartheid. To begin to underline the challenges of Christophobia within the context of...
You've muted yourself. Waltrina, you're muted. Waltrina, can you hear me? You're muted. You're muted, Waltrina. Thank you. Something happened. Sorry. Can you repeat that last sentence?
I can't hear you.
You're back.
Okay. I didn't press mute, so I think there's something that's going on there. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Should I begin over?
No, it was just the last paragraph.
Okay.
Sorry.
In order to begin to underline the challenges of Christophobia within the context of religious extremism, We must examine the roles of Christendom that Christendom has played over the course of history in the culture of violence against the humanity of minoritized communities across the diaspora. We must examine the cultural memory of communities that have been impacted and honor the sacred narratives and spiritual memories of the suffering amidst their movements of resistance towards true liberation. From my location as a person of African descent, religion and spirituality can be used strategically and creatively to disrupt systems of oppression and to challenge a culture of violence. For example, it is important to note the brush arbors of enslaved Africans in the United States. The secret meeting spaces were used to pass on culture, religion, oral history, and strategy making. It was an intersectional space for spiritual grounding, affirming the sanctity of life, and also for planning resistance. At a recent Harvard Divinity Forum, we discussed in conversation about religion as it pertains to U.S. domestic politics, and especially U.S. foreign policy that focuses on the institutional dimensions of religion, faith-based organizations, religious actors or authorities, transnational religious bodies, etc. In ways religion has always been a part of these forms of resistance, especially as practiced by some communities that have been minoritized. What happens to the conversation about religion when we include those social movements of resistance? I introduced the activist and itinerant minister, Sojourner Truth, an outspoken Black woman, feminist, and formerly enslaved person who became associated with women's suffrage movement and Black liberation. Her outspokenness on these issues ultimately revealed the racial divisiveness across several different movements for justice. She insisted in her speeches that we cannot fight for the liberation of white women for their cause when Black women and Black men continue to suffer. She emphasized the importance of finding solidarity across race, class, gender, and other divisions that seek to oppress some while liberating others. Truth faced great danger and risk as an unapologetic, outspoken Black woman in 19th century American society due to her bold stance and high profile on slavery and voting rights. Her messages challenged the provisions outlined in the 14th and 15th Amendment by supporting Black women's quest for liberation and equality and simultaneously advocating for suffrage rights for Black men. This undoubtedly heightened the threats against her and further isolated her from her European American women counterparts and stoked the tension between them. But her outspokenness was grounded in her Christian faith and more specifically Black liberation theology, because she said God told her to walk off of the plantation, and so she did. She freed herself and became an itinerant preacher, offering provocative messaging that challenged and deconstructed traditional Christian canonistic claims. Christian canonistic claims that seem to justify enslavement and apartheid systems in America. Her biblical interpretations rebuked national government, policies, laws, and norms in her 19th century society. She wasn't always in a church setting. She attended rallies on suffrage rights, but to her, they were all intersectional. Her location as a marginalized Black woman, as an activist, human rights advocate, and socio-political agitator, and clergy woman were all interconnected and foundational in her understanding of moral authority. Further, as her duty as a Christian servant and believer in a liberating God. Sojourner Truth used her moral authority rooted in Christendom to courageously preach and teach lessons on self-determination, socioeconomic divestment, and rejection of enslavement and apartheid systems in her America. Sojourner Truth made her religious location as a Christian believer and activist and a cultural disruptor, an accessible form of resistance for those who were Christians and who believed in God, but were also in a location of oppression, disinheritance, and who were invisibilized. Accessibility is critical here in challenging religious extremism. Accessible religion, as illustrated by Sojourner Truth, can be transformed into social movements. It is also affirming of the Imago Dei, which asserts we are each made in the image of God. Further, in the spirit of African religiosity, it also affirms Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, and we are because God is. Ubuntu recognizes nature, spirit world, and all of creation having a responsibility and duty to affirm life and oneness with God. Dr. Martin Luther King affirmed this in the sentiment, we are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I cannot be what I ought to be unless you are what you ought to be. This informs 20th and 21st century messengers of justice and prophetic witnesses like Angela Davis, who express, we cannot begin to fight for Black liberation if we are not concerned with the liberation of South Africans, Palestinians, and the pursuit of freedom of those in the diaspora who cry out for justice. This informs the Christian-centered and Black liberation theological proclamation of James Cones, who stated, God is on the side of the oppressed. This informs the movement for Black lives in the U.S. in its embrace of Assata Shakur's words, it is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. This informs the sanitary workers and union movement of the Poor People's Campaign that use as its rallying cry a simple phrase, I am a man. These statements, while for some appear secular, they are informed by Christological themes of beloved community, Mosaic principles of love, Imago Dei, and Christ's call for collective work and responsibility for our neighbors. Activism incorporating faith-centered rituals while demanding justice, moral authority is crucial. For example, Michael Brown, a teenager who was killed in St. Louis, Missouri, or Ferguson, Missouri. When he was killed, young activists and community members came to the place where he was murdered and memorialized that space. They protected that space. They honored the body and his humanity. For 4.5 hours, Michael Brown's body was in the sun, and people provided this young man cover and dignity, much like the biblical narrative of Rizpah in 2 Samuel 21. Rizpah was making a socio-political statement to the state against state-sanctioned violence, murder, torture, and domestic terrorism, and she was demanding spiritual dignity and honor by protecting the bodies from the beasts and birds and the wild. She could not give them a proper burial, but she could honor the bodies. When bodies are lynched, stolen, and harmed, and in the ways that we are witnessing genocide today, we find new ways to memorialize, and that can within itself be a socio-political statement and movement. The story of Rizpah is spoken of extensively in the book Radical Reconciliation by Curtis DeYoung and Alan Boesak. This brings to mind also Emmett Till, who was an American youth lynched in Money, Mississippi at the age of 14 years old in 1955 in the US. He was accused of making advances toward a white woman. His murder was clearly evidence of brutal injustices that was normalized within a racist American culture. And it served as a global messenger exposing America's hypocrisy in failing to address its own crimes against humanity while speaking out against so-called injustices or marginalization by states around the globe that fit its own socioeconomic interests. The stage for this was the church, the funeral, Black religiosity on display, a mother in mourning being comforted by the church, and at the same time, the church in solidarity with a global outrage of racial injustice. I want to pause just briefly to celebrate the specific role of the Black church experience here, as it has always been a model of socio-political intersection in dialogue with movements across the United States, but across the world. We have activists such as Ella Baker, Fatima Clark, Kwame Ture, Assata Shakur, Martin Luther King, and so many others who've utilized faith-based spaces and sentimentalities to stimulate thought, education, training, and strategies to implement political action and social movements and national policy changes. Such agency had global impact in reimagining multi-tiered prophetic witnessing and the responsibility of faith communities, and in this particular example, Black church role and responsibility to speak out against lynching, genocide, apartheid, and other forms of global suffering. One example of this is the intersection of the death witnessed by Abel Meeropol, a Jewish poet, and Billie Holiday, an African-American vocalist and activist. Meeropol's poem, Bitter Fruit, was in response to lynching with Hitler's crimes against humanity. But Billie Holiday used the poem, and turned into a song to create dialogue around lynching in America. This was an example of transnational dialogue through the arts, through faith and religion, and through cultural location. There's so many different examples of ways that movements for Black lives and solidarity across the globe is significant in furthering dialogue around messages, movements for justice in Palestine and abroad. In a sermon at the Trinity Church, Wall Street of New York, Dr. Renita Weems asked a simple question: is that you, God? Her text was Jeremiah 37, verses 16 through 17, where she asked, is there any word from the Lord? We are called to a moment in history and a time when we must challenge the wrong. The prophet is called to be prophetic in moments that causes unease and to not excuse the wrong. When we see genocide in our society, we must ask the question, is that you, God? When we see apartheid in our society, we must ask the question, is that you, God? When we see young children murdered and parents stolen from them, becoming ancestors too soon and orphans in the street crying out in hunger, we must ask the question, is that you, God? When we see dispossession of land, poverty, and murder justified by US sanctions and weaponization of Israeli forces, we must ask the question, is that you, God? The narratives of the poor, the marginalized, and the suffering may bring us closer to hearing not only the voice of God, but witnessing the presence of God, holding them and affirming them as they fight for justice and liberation amidst their suffering. In Ferguson, the community strategically called the faith institutions to action. There was a very specific call for institutional religious leaders to show up, to not leave the rituals, but to use its power and influence to protect the practice that was already occurring on the ground in the uncalled, unrolled, and unanointed spaces. To borrow a line from Toni Morrison, beloved, activists said, I am not godless, but your place of worship does not welcome me in my location. I am not godless, but your place of worship does not welcome me in my full humanity. And so often sacred spaces, an extension of Christian and religiosity, are created in the streets amidst protests. And spiritual rituals are now formed that affirms the humanity of all and the sanctity of life. The humility witnessed when powerful faith leaders respected the space community organizers created by abiding to their call to action was transformative and affirming that there is space for witness, prophetic witness, and action, and as long as it is made accessible for all. What is also critical to note in that the movements for Black lives carry an international agenda, which includes areas of advocacy and action too often overlooked in traditional or mainstream socio-political forums, such as solidarity for Palestinian liberation movements. The movement for Black Lives solidarity with the Palestinian Liberation Movement exposed U.S. links to funding militarism and state-sanctioned terror, both in America and abroad. The parallel between the struggles of Blacks and minorities communities faced in America and the challenges Palestinians face has long been voiced by scholars, activists, authors, and cultural ambassadors like Alice Walker, Danny Glover, Angela Davis, and beyond. In Davis's book, If They Come in the Morning, Angela Davis, along with a premier list of contributing essayists, said that in order to address the political prisoners, police brutality, and state-sanctioned violence in America, we must be conscious of the global and unlawful detainment, abuse, and killing of political prisoners in Palestine. It is essential to note that her prophetic witness still is true and important today. For us to take up the prophetic and courageous call to bear witness not only to the suffering of Blacks, Brown, and Indigenous communities in America and in the diaspora, but to be mindful of the ways that the militarized occupation, land grabbing, violation of global peace accords in Palestine, and apartheid and genocide and apartheid, these crimes against their humanity is intersectional and relevant to our own freedom movements wherever we are located today. In conclusion, the role of Christendom in global movements for freedom, justice, and accountability in the world is a theme throughout time. It's most effective when there is self-critique and an inability to examine the ways Christianity and religion has been used as a weapon to normalize cultures of violence, such as apartheid and genocide and enslavement throughout the course of time. The indigenous grassroots manifestation of resistance is important in order to achieve a broader and inclusive ways of viewing Christendom in our society today. Thank you.
Wow. Well, Trina, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm sure folk will want to listen to your presentation again. There was so much you were preaching to me, certainly. I'm familiar with a number of the individuals you highlighted who've been inspirational to you and to many, but I wasn't familiar with Sojourner Truth. I wonder if in the chat you could give us a hyperlink to perhaps a source or a book that you'd recommend we access to find out more about her life and her work. So thank you for that very much indeed, Waltrina. Thank you. Do participants do put into the chat questions that you have for Brant and for Waltrina from their presentations, and also for Paul, who I will now introduce. The Reverend Dr. Paul Mc Allister is founder and president of Global Leaders in Unity and Involvement. It's a public policy and human rights advocacy think tank organization. Paul also serves on the Theology Task Force of the Interfaith Relations Convening Table of the National Council of Churches USA. And Paul is also a Bonhoeffer Fellow of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership at Hebrew College. Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to be here, my good friend, Dr. Sizer, and it's good to see Waltrina, who I've not seen in roughly 4 or 5 years, and also good to meet Brant Rosen and see all of you today. I've enjoyed the presentations that I have heard up to this point, and I'm looking forward to the conversations that will take place after I finish my brief presentation today. Before I start, I would like to simply say having done some extensive travel, both in Palestine as well as in Ukraine, and having flown the flag of Ukraine, you see it over my right shoulder, a Ukrainian flag. And that is because I also happen to lead the North Carolina delegation with the American Coalition for Ukraine. And as you have perhaps heard, our Congress has recently approved a $60 billion military aid package for Ukraine in its quest against Russia. Why is that important in the context of our topic for today, which deals with Christian persecution? I have many friends who live in Ukraine, and many of them are members of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and they understand with bitter passion what has happened to them at the hands not only of Vladimir Putin, but also the Russian Orthodox Church. And to see the conflation of Christian ideals and the mixture of misunderstandings that have evolved and surfaced and produced so much conflict and heartache and tragedy is something that we must give extraordinary attention to within the National Council of Churches. We're certainly seeking to do that as we deal with not only Christian nationalism here in the United States, but also seek to reconcile our own issues with Christian nationalism in the context of how we deal with religious nationalism more broadly in a global context. I wanted to sort of frame what I'm about to say in that language because I think towards the end of my talk, we may be able to bring all of these ideas together in a way that is meaningful to us, even as we address the problem and the challenges associated with another type of nationalism, which we know in Israel as Zionism. And of course, we can also talk about Christian Zionism, which is an expression of supremacist ideals in the context of Christianity. Given today's supercharged political climate after Hamas's actions on October 7th and protests against genocide in Gaza and West Bank Israeli settler violence, I want to call particular attention today to the actions of Israel's far-right National Security Defense Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has been mentioned already by Brant, prior to October 7th, most notably during one of his visits, which are all too frequent, to the Al-Aqsa compound in East Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day in May of 2023. I think about that episode wherein he said, according to Al Jazeera's news agency, all of the threats from Hamas will not help. We are in charge here in Jerusalem and all the rest of the land of Israel. Now you think about that. 6 months later, or fewer than 6 months later, Hamas retaliates or responds aggressively, perhaps in ways that make our stomachs churn, but they respond. And this particular forceful statement, all of the threats from Hamas will not help. This is coming from an individual who is known to have had many issues as of late with the Christian community in Israel. And so as we think about the nexus between what happened on October 7th and remind ourselves that this struggle has not simply ensued because of a few isolated incidences here and there, but this has been a long-standing struggle. The question that I pose for us today is, what is our moral responsibility as Christians amid hardships and persecutions, not just against Christians, but also against all people of faith? I'm reminded of the passage of scripture where Abel is killed by Cain in Genesis, and Cain is confronted by God, and the question that he poses to God is, am I my brother's keeper? And as Christians, this is the question that we have to ask of all people of faith, and particularly Abrahamic faiths. Are we not also our brother and our sister's keeper? Do we not have a moral, spiritual, legal, human obligation to not simply be concerned about our own interests, our own welfare, our own systems of belief, those things and teachings that hold our own Christian communities together? Or do we have a responsibility to look beyond our immediate circle, even as we recognize the fact that Jesus said, I have other sheep who are not of this fold? I ask these questions in the context of Ben Gvir because when we look at his history tells us the projection of a theme that counters all of the opportunities that we should pursue as Christians, even when we are finding ourselves enduring hardships at the hands of those who oppose what it is we stand for. Who was the teacher, the leader, the model, the influencer of one Ben Gvir? You think of one Rabbi Martin David Kahane. He was actually born in Brooklyn, New York in 1932. As a teenager, he joined Betar, a quasi-military youth group affiliated with the revisionist Zionist movement, which sought a Jewish state in all of British-ruled Palestine. In 1968, Kahane, who trained as a lawyer and a rabbi, formed the Jewish Defense League, a militant group that promoted Jewish vigilantism and urged American Jews to arm themselves under the slogan, "Every Jew a 22." He went on to target the officers and representatives of Soviet bloc nations, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, Arab states, and any Jewish organizations that he saw as too moderate. He also espoused anti-Arab teachings and eventually founded and led the Koch Party. Its name means thus in Hebrew, until he was ultimately assassinated in New York in 1990. Subsequently, his fight was taken up by his son Benjamin, the leader of Kahane Kai, or Kahane Lives, before he was also killed along with his wife by Palestinian militants in a drive-by shooting in the West Bank in December of 2000. I mentioned Rabbi Kahane because of his background and the tremendous impact that he continues to have in Israeli politics, in the treatment of Arabs, of Palestinians, of Muslims, and in the context of today's conversation, the impact that he continues to have upon the Christian church. Recently, in June 2022, New Arab magazine produced an in-depth report noting how Koch's founding and Rabbi Kahane's death continued to influence the politics and the day-to-day life of Christians in Israel. It specifically pointed out the fact that it was one Ben-Gvir who was responsible for defending an extremist who launched a major attack against Israelis and against Christians. It was Ben-Gvir who decided that not only would he continue to rabble-rouse and trouble and inflame the Jewish supremacist movement to make it more influential today and more radical than it was even during its inception, but it is this same disciple who was elected to the Knesset in 2021 under the Jewish Power Party, and many of today's activists consider him to be their hero in the same way that he considered Kahane to be his hero. Now, when we think about how lawmakers have supported Ben-Gvir in his provocative endeavors, like setting up makeshift offices in the Flashpoint neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, we see him as a firebrand politician who is increasing in popularity rather than diminishing in popularity. And one would have to ask, what is the impact of October 7th upon those Kahanists who were thought to be in a very strategic position to secure more power unto themselves? What is the role of Christians and the Christian church in its response and reaction to the inflammatory remarks and the decisively hostile and bitter narrative that is being created and inspired and proliferated across all of Israel and indeed throughout the entire world? I live in the United States, obviously. And as an American, one of what we're witnessing here, as many of you know, on college campuses is a strong reaction to what is happening in Gaza. This strong reaction is being stirred by students who are standing up against what they believe to be not only genocide, but moral inturpitude, not only in Israel, but even against our own government. And many of these individuals who profess no faith recognize the fact that our country says it is a Christian nation. There's a big fight, as Rabbi Brant has already alluded to, Christian nationalism going on within Christianity today in our country that says we need to go back to the founding principles of our nation rooted in Christianity. But our students are asking us the question, what type of Christianity is it that fails to take a moral stand against the wrongness that we see happening across the world? And so the question that I'm really posing as I'm speaking is, where is the strength and the courage, the magnanimity, and the responsibility of Christians? Should we rely upon merely the role of students, or should we be exemplary in our faith and be willing to suffer the consequences for taking a stance against those things that are wrong, knowing full well that there are powerful, influential voices like Ben-Gvir that we are contesting, that are brutal, in their reaction and response to them because of fear. What is it that Christians should not fear in the midst of being placed within a kind of arrangement where we know that when we speak truth to power, there are consequences that we have to bear? I want to say a little more based upon some of the notes that I have written regarding persecution that has taken place in the church. I mentioned a situation with Ben-Gvir being the lawyer of one who had committed some extremist, aggressive arsonist acts. This actually took place several years ago at Tagba, Israel. This occurred specifically in the Benedictine church of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. This extremist act of arson was defended by Ben-Gvir, who was now, of course, the national security minister in what has been described as the most extreme right-wing religious government in Israel's history. Christians are confronting a force that is one of the most powerful negating forces of Christian faith, of Christian moral character, of Christian principle that it has ever had to contend with. And even though we face these severe, extraordinary actions that are burning the house down, so to speak, there is still a different level of response. The terror that one experiences outwardly, Jesus says, should not become the means whereby the voice of his disciples are silenced. In other words, he said, do not fear those who can destroy merely the body, but fear him, meaning God, who can destroy both body and soul in hell. We have a deeper responsibility than to look after our own interests in a temporal, short-term, narrowly framed context. The terror that we should fear most is the response that God has. And therefore, we applaud all of those heroes and sheroes. And Waltrina mentioned some within the African-American tradition. She mentioned Sojourner Truth. She might well have mentioned also Harriet Tubman. If she wanted to speak to the 1960s civil rights movement, she could have easily mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. These were women of deep faith and conscience. And then there are also others on this call today who have faced intense persecution. Our moderator himself has been on the firing line of pressure from the Christian church inwardly or internally, as well as from those outside of the Christian frame. Christophobia is not just about fearing Christ or fearing Christ followers. It is about fearing the power that we have and the courage when we align ourselves with that ultimate power of what can be revealed as right and truth and moral and just in an unjust world. Christophobia, and therefore Christian persecution, is about seeking to diminish the moral character of the church as well as the moral authority of God in the world. This is what we are contending with when we think about Christian Zionism. This is what we're contending with when we think about Christian persecution and the diminishment of the voices of those who seek to speak truth to power. How much time do I have left?
2 or 3 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 or 3 minutes. Mitri Raheb has written a book entitled The Politics of Persecution. And I would encourage all of us to not only read that book fastidiously, but to understand that the central message is there has always been an opportunity to misread history and to read history through the lens of colonialism or empire. The Christian mandate today is to stare empire squarely in the eyes. And this is why I mention our students, because oftentimes our clergymen and women fail to do what even our students can see. Thus, I would echo the words of Scripture, and a little child shall lead them. We are being taught and being led and being influenced to think as we ought to think by those who many of us have poured our lives and heart and soul into through the teachings of Jesus. And yet these teachings of Jesus are finding fresh, vibrant, renewed, courageous voice in ways that supersede oftentimes the message of Christian congregations. We have to reverse this trend. We have to have the character and the strength and the stamina and the will and the faith to look opposition squarely in the eyes and with faith continue to say, I believe in justice, I believe in right, I believe in truth, and most of all, I still believe in the liberation of an ancient people from the land of Israel as a model of what God wants to do and is able to do in the souls of men and women and children who see him as the perfecter and the rewarder and the benefactor of our Christian faith. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much. It's much to think about there. Particularly helpful to see the context for much of what Ben Guriérrez has been doing and saying and acting. And we look forward to reading Mitri Raheb's book, Politics of Persecution. Thank you for encouraging us to do that. A number of our participants have asked questions, which I've made a list of, and I think Lily's going to help me with if I've missed any. But before we do that, we would really like Waltrina, Brant, and Paul to engage with each other. The floor is yours between the three of you to comment on your presentations or ask questions of each other, and we will be your audience, your students. So away you go. Brant, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and Waltrina.
No, please, Reverend Mc Allister, please.
I'm not sure which one of you mentioned, and perhaps it is both of you, who talked about the need for transnational dialogue, which some might interpret as interfaith dialogue. But would you elaborate a little more on how transnational dialogue fits into the theme that we're speaking of today, particularly when we talk about the suffering of Christians around the world, as well as in Palestine?
Well, for me, thank you for that. And thank you both. I enjoyed your presentations very much. I think it's really important to understand that we can't begin to speak on Christendom or any type of component of Christianity without having a deeper understanding of indigenous religiosity that is experienced or practiced across the globe. You can't begin to speak about the enslaved African Christian experience without also understanding how that intersects with indigenous. You can't begin to speak to women and men of Haiti about their struggles. And
can you turn your volume up, please, Waltrina? You were a bit quiet, but we could hear you.
I think the mic was unplugged.
Keep going, Waltrina.
okay, I'm something is muting me. I'm not muting myself, so I'm not sure what's happening. But I guess basically, in short, when we look at struggles across the globe, where there may be a practice of religion or faith in a Christological point of view, there's also still some indigenous form of practice that may underline and inform and intersect with that faith. And it's really important, if we're going to be in solidarity with movements for freedom and justice, that we have respect for and understanding of those intersections. And when we look at movements throughout the course of time, it required global solidarity and a respect for the ways that we entered into those spaces in those movements alongside our religious identities, indigenous and mainline faith communities as well.
Thank you. Brant, do you want to comment on that?
No, just to amplify what Reverend Middleton said. I think this needs to be an international struggle, and I think internationalism is something we don't hear lifted up enough. Frankly, I think it had its day, but I think we're struggles too often become compartmentalized, and so I think the kinds of things that Reverend Middleton is lifting up for us, I think, is enormously important. And there's many reasons why I think we are all kind of operating out of our separate corners. It's a very tangled history that we're talking about here. Western Christianity, European Christianity rather, had a very deep and lasting impact on Jewish identity, for instance. But yet, I think many contemporary Jews, particularly white Jews, kind of internalize many of these white European identity and assumption issues in ways that we don't completely realize. And there are also Jews of color. I mean, being Jewish is an international phenomenon, right? There are Jews from MENA. There are Jews of color in the United States. So we're just beginning to, I think, untangle and unpack what it means to be an international community, a diaspora community as Jewish people, and understand the ways that white supremacy brings to bear on how we operate within Jewish life. And I think going forward, we need to expand, these struggles and these interrogations to understand the ways intersectionally that our struggles are ultimately going to need to be connected if we're going to prevail.
And I agree. I just recall as a student when there was a call for international community to come to South Africa during the elections to bear witness to the elections. And even the example of Emmett Till's mother putting her son's body on display. It was the global outcry in those respective places that helped to magnify the injustices. And I believe that also helped to take those movements to the next level. And I think someone said in the chat, working in silos is very difficult to amplify the message. But when you have people from across the globe bearing witness to the suffering and pain. What can be denied within your local realm cannot be denied when the eyes of the world is upon you.
That's very helpful. Waltrina, just to add to that, that's one reason why this conference in November will be an international conference addressing religious extremism. And we hope that what we're seeing between the three of you now will be amplified in the context of the whole conference.
Yes.
Paul, do you want to comment on what Waltrina said, or Brant?
Well, I would simply, what I'm thinking, Stephen, as we sit here, is the kinds of religious extremism that we're seeing in Sudan or in India. Christians are certainly under persecution, and this is the thing that we see today. But we have to be sensitive to the hardships of others. We need to be sensitive to the hardships of Muslims in India, under Modi, for example. We cannot separate, and what I'm hearing is we can't separate our own interest from those interests that are taking place elsewhere. I think the more we do that, it gives us a more clear picture of what is happening in the world, of how Christ would have us to respond to the conditions and the circumstances that we are seeing in the world, how to be more effective in Christian witness in the world, and more specifically, how to manufacture a consistent and coherent definition of what justice looks like and represents in the world, and in particular for the future generations that will follow after us.
Thank you.
I wanted to, yes, I have just a reflection that I would welcome my co-panelists to share in. And here in the United States in particular, you know, we see the University of California, the valedictorian who was disinvited from giving her speech, and then they went even further and uninvited all of the speakers. We see in New York and across the country here, college students protesting, some who've been suspended, threatened, and even university professors that have been fired because of their outspokenness and courageous stance in solidarity with Palestinians. You know, and when we think about the role of students in these movements throughout the course of time, and also the role of academic centers, I'm wondering your thoughts on the state of academic institutions and the fears, the fear-mongering that's causing them to be silent and to silence their students when students have been such a critical part of these movements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are in a moment. There is no question we are in a moment. And it's a convergence of a lot of things. This didn't start yesterday, you know. There's so much to say about this, but I'll just say that, and I want to lift up what Reverend Mc Allister was saying about, you know, young people and students really leading the way, which they are truly doing. And it's, you know, more than a few people have commented that this is very reminiscent of the late 60s in the United States during the Vietnam War, when campuses were places of both intense repression and academia being used as a tool of the state and really bending to the state, and students having none of it and resisting in the loudest way possible. The circumstances are a little bit different. Every era is different, but the basics are the same. And I can't help but see that I think we're at where things are breaking wide open on so many different levels. I think the desperation of the powers that be that are using this issue, particularly the issue of anti-Semitism, cynically as a wedge issue to in their crusade against you know, what they call liberalism on college campuses, and their attack on critical race theory and DEI and all of this, using anti-Semitism and the current genocide in Gaza as a wedge, there are students who are absolutely having none of it, and they're resisting in the most powerful way possible. And speaking as a Jew, this cynical use of invoking anti-Semitism and Jewish students being unsafe during a time of genocide. I mean, during a time when we are reading about 35,000 people and 15,000 children being destroyed. The young people on campuses see right through this, non-Jews and Jews alike. 2 nights ago, there was a public Passover Seder at Columbia University, led by Jewish students, but participating with Muslims and people of color and allies, people of all faiths. It was astonishing. It was one of the most purest expressions of Passover I've ever seen. And it indicates to me that that the resistance is going to continue to be fierce. And I agree with Reverend Mc Allister when I say the young people shall lead us, but it can't only be them. They can't be the only ones making the sacrifices, and they are making sacrifices. They are being suspended. They're now at the threat of being expelled. This is very, very real, but it's a breaking point, and breaking points can be leveraged in powerful ways, which is, I think, our hope.
I think you've answered so thoroughly. I will point out that I have a daughter who finds herself. She was in Chicago visiting her sister, and she was going back to her university where she is a PhD student and continuing the fight. So what's happening is our young people are seeing the need to come together from across all walks, all dimensions, all spaces and narratives of life. They're really modeling, in my view, the message of the Good Samaritan. When Jesus says, I must needs, if you look at the King James Version, I have to go through Jerusalem, or rather, I have to go through Samaria. I have to do it. And we look at them and we ask, why do you have to do what it is you're doing? I don't think many of them can actually give a plausible explanation, except they're caught up in the spirit of the times and the energy of the times. And they know that this is a moment that they must seize. And so there is a power in what they're doing in going up against the other powers of this world. Really, they are modeling the message of Isaiah when he prophesied that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. They are embodying that witness in ways that don't require a turned around collar if you're clergy, or don't require a hymn book. The hymn is the hymn of God's grace and God's will and God's love for all. And that power, that hymn, that song is greater, in my view, in my estimation, than any of the risks that they have found are worth taking, because the cause is so much greater and the reward for all of us is so much more beautiful.
Thank you so much, Paul. We're going to wrap it up now. I want to, on behalf of everyone participating, sincere, grateful thanks to Rabbi Brant Rosen, the Reverend Dr. Waltrina Middleton, and the Reverend Dr. Mc Allister for your presentations. And we are looking forward to seeing you again, God willing, at the International Conference in November, participating hopefully face-to-face, but if not, certainly online. So we look forward to that very much. I'm going to hand back to Omar to tell us what's happening next, but just very quickly, 2 questions that did come up that are practical ones. Someone asked what happens in relation to the conference if the Israelis deny visas on entry. The answer to that shortly is we don't believe they will, because Israel wants visitors, it needs tourists, and we don't envisage there being any issues when you arrive receiving the standard entry visa. Someone else asked whether the fact that there may be travel advisories, i.e. our government's advising against travel to Israel, whether that will affect the conference. It won't affect the conference in the sense that the conference will take place in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, for those who are able to come. There are local people who want indigenous folk, as well as expats who will be attending, and as many of us internationals who can will. Accommodation and travel will be covered and provided, but we may find that insurance is difficult, expensive, or impractical. I personally am attending whether I'm able to get insurance or not, but insurance is available, but you will have to search for it, and it may be expensive. Omar, over to you. Omar? Lily, are you with Omar at the moment?
I'm not with Omar, but I'm happy to go ahead and present, just introducing our webinar for next month, if Omar is unable to join us. Okay, are you able to see this flyer, everyone? So next month, Sabeel, in coordination with Father David Neuhaus and Hadar Cohen, are arranging for our next webinar to be a further discussion on anti-Semitism. We had our February webinar, which was entitled Zionism and Anti-Semitism, and we want to continue the conversation in addition to discussing the weaponization of anti-Semitism, but also to discuss more of the history and the experience, particularly also of Jews who are outspoken on behalf of Palestine and their experience with anti-Semitism. And so this is what we have upcoming on Wednesday, May 29th at 8 p.m., the same time, the final Wednesday of the month of May. We encourage you to also attend this webinar and keep coming back for these conversations as we prepare for the November conference. And as you can see, the link and the link to register for the conference are on Sabeel's website. So you can access via this flyer or Sabeel's website as well. So that's what's upcoming for the month of May.
Thank you, Lily. Do you have the flyer for the visual for the Red Heifer and Temple webinar?
I can pull it up real quickly if you want to explain it briefly, Stephen.
Yes, Sabeel is organizing another webinar. It's not part of this series linked directly to the conference, but we are arranging another webinar on the issue of the Red Heifer and the plans to rebuild the Jewish temple. We see this as another dimension to religious extremism. It's a very controversial issue, and it's going to be on the 29th of April, which is next Monday. And Lily, have you found the promo for that? Not yet. Yes, a number of us are going to participate in that webinar. I'm doing the theology of the reasons why the temple, Zionists wish to rebuild the temple and why it's unnecessary.
Stephen, I think your explanation is enough to sell it for now. But know that it will be also included in Sabeel's newsletter, the flyer and the information to register.
Thank you. And do check out sabeel.org for more information about the conference in November. Please register. and please circulate information about next month's webinar. So thank you once again to Brant, Waltrina, and Paul for your very moving and challenging presentations tonight. Thank you to everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you.